So today we are going to talk about gearboxes and why they fail. So why gearboxes fail. So there are quite a number of reasons as to why a gearbox can fail, and I'm going to highlight just a few of them and explain them in detail. And one of the main reasons why gearboxes fail is what we call mechanical issues. So number one, we have mechanical issues. Mechanical issues. And now I'll go on further to subdivide mechanical issues. So number one under mechanical issues is what we call a clogged gearbox oil filter. Gearbox oil filter. And now a gearbox oil, this is simply what we call the transmission fluid. Just for clarification. Transmission fluid. So let me do a very simple illustration of your gearbox. Let's say over here you have your gearbox, and then right under your gearbox you've got the gearbox oil sump. So this is where you have your sump. This is where your transmission fluid is at. And then over here we have the filter, that is the transmission fluid filter, that now sieves out any particles from the transmission fluid before sending the transmission fluid into your gearbox. So if the filter is clogged up, it simply means that it restricts the amount of transmission fluid that gets to your gearbox. And now, when there is less oil getting to your gearbox, it simply means that the metal component will start grinding on into each other, resulting to the failure of your gearbox. We have another very important component that is known as a magnet. In every gearbox oil sump, we have a magnet. And the purpose of a magnet is to attract any metal filings or metal shavings that may be produced when the gears are grinding onto each other. So if you go for a transmission change, as in you're going to service your gearbox, and you find that there's a lot of metal shavings around the magnet, then that should worry you. Because that simply means that their components, the metal components in your gearbox, are grinding onto each other and your gearbox is on its way out. So let's go on to the second point under the mechanical issues, and that one is use of the wrong transmission fluid. So use of wrong transmission fluid. What you need to understand is that there are different types of transmission fluids. We have the ATF and we have the CVT. So if maybe your car is using the ATF fluid, and then by accident you fill it up with the CVT, then your gearbox is going to fail in a very short time. If you do the other case in vice versa, you have a CVT gearbox and then you fill it up with an ATF, then your CVT gearbox is on its way out too. Now let me go to the third point. And now the third point under mechanical issues is what I would call the clutch system. And I know this might shock you, because when you hear clutch, the first thing that comes into your mind is a manual car. Even the automatic cars come with inbuilt clutches. So what happens is, when you have, let me talk about specifically a manual car. In a manual car, your clutch system has two components. It has something we call the slave cylinder, and it has something else we call the master cylinder. So if these two components fail, it results into your gears do not engage as easily as they should. That means you'll always be forcing the gears to engage. And if you force the gears to engage, that will result into the grinding, which will eventually lead to your gearbox failing. Now, on to point number 2. We are done with the mechanical issues. Let's highlight the second reason as to why gearboxes fail. And when it comes to gearboxes some of the reasons as to why they fail, other than the mechanical issues, is something we call driving habits. And I know this one, people might raise a lot of issues against it. They made debate about it, but then the truth is truth. As in, there's no sugarcoating it. And sometimes the truth is always a bitter pill to swallow. So on to number 2 is what we call the driving habits. Now, how do driving habits result into failure of a gearbox? On to driving habits. And I know this one will really hit hard. It will really hit hard for those who really love to hard accelerate and push the pedal to the metal. Anyway, driving habits, number 1, it's hard acceleration. What do I mean by hard acceleration? Let me draw a CVT gearbox. A CVT operates on pulleys and belts. Let me use the illustration of a CVT gearbox. And you know, a CVT gearbox operates on the principle of pulleys and belt. So when you are hard accelerating, you are exerting a lot of pressure on this belt. You know, when you exert a lot of pressure on the belt, over time, the belt will be loose. And now when this belt is loose, it results into something we call slipping. And now when the belt starts slipping, it will result into slippage of your gears. And now that will lead to the failure of your gearbox. So let's go on to another one. Under still the driving habits, other than hard acceleration, we've got what we call the use of the wrong gears. Use of the wrong gears, and this one is specifically in manual cars. Most manual cars, we have gear number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, onwards. So most of the times, because you want to save on your fuel, you want to engage a high gear. But then what you don't understand is that every gear has a specific speed at which the car should be moving. Gear number 1 has a specific speed, gear number 2, gear number 3. For gear number 1, gear number 2, gear number 3, you're supposed to be going at a considerable speed when you've engaged them. But gear number 4 and gear number 5, they're what I would call highway gears, because the car is supposed to be moving at a high speed. So if you engage gear number 4, whereas you're supposed to be on gear number 2, now this will result into you ruining the gears inside your gearbox, and now that will result into a failed gearbox. If maybe, for instance, you have engaged gear number 5 because you want to save on the few coins of fuel, and in the place where you're supposed to engage gear number 3, you've engaged gear number 5. So over time, your gearbox will fail out on you. Now, other than the driving habits, let's look onto another cause that results into your gearbox failing. And number 3 is what we call age. Age is something that cannot be avoided. And with age comes increased wear and tear. So the more your gearbox ages, it results into something we call wear and tear. And now understand one thing. In a gearbox, there are so many grinding or moving components. And over time, because of the grinding onto each other or the moving components, wear and tear has to happen. So what happens is that one component will start failing, then followed by another. That is due to age. So you might ask me, if your gearbox has failed, should you repair or rebuild? Just repair/rebuild, or just replace? That is, buying a new gearbox. Buy a new one. My very solid advice would be this: replace, buy a new gearbox. That is simply because when a gearbox has failed, if maybe this time it's the synchronizers that have failed, you decide to replace the synchronizers. In a matter of time, something else is going to fail. So it will always be a repetitive process of replacing one thing after the other. So if you really want to have that ample time and for the car to serve you well, consider buying a new gearbox. That is the best solution, and it will ensure that you enjoy driving your car. So once again, if you've not yet subscribed to my YouTube channel, please consider subscribing. Thank you.